Earlier today, members of the United States Senate and House of Representatives convened for a joint meeting on Capitol Hill. The purpose, to count ballots cast last month by members of the Electoral College. Under the rules of the Constitution, this was the formal election of Governor Bill Clinton of Arkansas as President of the United States, and Tennessee Senator Albert Gore as Vice President. Next, on C-SPAN, we take you to the chamber of the United States House of Representatives for today's proceedings.
Mr. Speaker, the Vice President in the United States Senate.
Mr. Speaker and members of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, pursuant to the requirements of the Constitution and the laws of the United States, are meeting in joint session for the purpose of opening the certificates and ascertaining and counting the votes of the electors of the several states for President and Vice President. Under well-established precedents, unless a motion shall be made in any case, the reading of the formal portions of the certificates will be dispensed with. After ascertainment has been had that the certificates are authentic and correct in form, the tellers will count and make a list of the votes cast by the electors of the several states. The tellers on part of the two houses will take their places at the clerk's desk. The chair hands to the tellers the certificates of the electors for President and Vice President of the state of Alabama, and they will count and make a list of the votes cast by that state.
Mr. President, the certificate of electoral vote for the state of Alabama seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears, therefore, that George Bush of the state of Texas received 9 votes for president, and Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana received 9 votes for vice president.
If there is no objection, the chair will omit in the further procedure the formal statement just made, and we will open the certificates in alphabetical order and pass to the tellers the certificates showing the votes of the electors in each state. And the tellers will then read, count, and announce the result in each state as was done with respect to the state of Alabama. The chair hears no objection.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Alaska seems to be regular in form and authentic. It appears therefrom that George Bush of the state of Texas received 3 votes for president, and Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana received 3 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Arizona seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears that George Bush of the state of Texas received 8 votes for president, and Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana received 8 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Arkansas seems to be in regular form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 6 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 6 votes for vice president. Mr. President, it's my pleasure to announce the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of California seems to be in regular form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 54 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 54 votes for vice president.
Well done. Well done. Well done. I like the state, but I didn't like the result.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Colorado seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 8 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 8 votes for vice president. I give you Alabama too.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Connecticut seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 8 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 8 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Delaware seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 3 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 3 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the District of Columbia seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 3 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 3 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of electoral vote of the state of Florida seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that George Bush of the state of Texas received 25 votes for president, and Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana received 25 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Georgia seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 13 votes for president, and that Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 13 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Hawaii seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 4 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 4 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Idaho seems to be in regular form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that George Bush of the state of Texas received 4 votes for president, and Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana received 4 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of electoral vote of the state of Illinois seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 22 votes for president, votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Indiana seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that George Bush of the state of Texas received 12 votes for president, and that Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana received 12 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Iowa seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 7 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 7 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Kansas seems to be in regular form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that George Bush of the state of Texas received 6 votes for president, and Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana received 6 votes for vice president.
Hand me the basketball capital of the world. Mr. President, the certificate of electoral vote of the Commonwealth of Kentucky seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 8 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 8 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Louisiana seems to be regular in form and authentic, and appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 9 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 9 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Maine seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 4 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 4 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Maryland seems to be in regular form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 10 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 10 votes for vice president.
Calm down. Mr. President, the certificate of electoral vote of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts seems to be regular in form and authentic, and appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 12 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 12 votes for vice president.
Sign those for me. Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Michigan appears to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 18 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 18 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Minnesota seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 10 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 10 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Mississippi seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that George Bush of the state of Texas received 7 votes for president, and Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana received 7 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Missouri seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 11 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 11 votes for vice president. You signing these things, Charlie?
Did you sign those things for us, Chairman? Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Montana seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 3 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 3 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Nebraska seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that George Bush of the state of Texas received 5 votes for president, and Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana received 5 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Nevada seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 4 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 4 votes for vice president.
You got one happy cowboy out there, ain't you? Yeah. Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of New Hampshire seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 4 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 4 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of New Jersey seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 15 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 15 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of New Mexico seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 5 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 5 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of New York seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 33 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 33 votes for vice president.
Let me do North Carolina. Oh, yeah. Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of North Carolina seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that George Bush of the state of Texas received 14 votes for president, and Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana received 14 votes for vice president.
Al? Charlie's bigger than I am. I don't want to buck him anyway. Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of North Dakota seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that George Bush of the state of Texas received 3 votes for president. Dan Quayle, state of Indiana, received 3 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Ohio seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 21 votes for president, and that Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 21 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Oklahoma seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that George Bush of the state of Texas received 8 votes for president, and Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana received 8 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Oregon seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 7 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 7 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 23 votes for president. Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 23 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Rhode Island seems to be regular in form and authentic, and appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 4 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 4 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of South Carolina seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that George Bush of the state of Texas received 8 votes for president, and Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana received 8 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of South Dakota seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that George Bush of the state of Texas received 3 votes for president, and Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana received 3 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Tennessee seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 11 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 11 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Texas seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that George Bush of the state of Texas received 32 votes for president, and Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana received 32 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Utah seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that George Bush of the state of Texas received 5 votes for president, and Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana received 5 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Vermont seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 3 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 3 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the Commonwealth of Virginia seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that George Bush of the state of Texas received 13 votes for president, and Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana received 13 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Washington seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 11 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 11 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of West Virginia seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 5 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 5 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Wisconsin seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas received 11 votes for president, and Al Gore of the state of Tennessee received 11 votes for vice president.
Mr. President, the certificate of the electoral vote of the state of Wyoming seems to be regular in form and authentic, and it appears therefrom that George Bush of the state of Texas received 3 votes for president. Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana received 3 votes for vice president.
Gentlemen and gentlewomen of the Congress, the certificates of all the states have now been opened and read, and the tellers will make final ascertainment of the result and deliver the same to the President of the Senate. The state of the vote for President of the United States as delivered to the President of the Senate is as follows. The whole number of electors appointed to vote for President of the United States is 538, of which a majority is 270. Bill Clinton of the state of Arkansas has received for President of the United States 370 votes. George Bush of the state of Texas has received 168 votes. The state of the vote for Vice President of the United States as delivered to the President of the Senate is as follows. The whole number of electors appointed to vote for the Vice President of the United States is 538, of which a majority is 270. Al Gore of the state of Tennessee has received for Vice President of the United States 370 votes. Dan Quayle of the state of Indiana has received 168 votes. This announcement shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the persons elected President and Vice President of the United States, each for the term beginning on the 20th day of January 1993, and shall be entered together with a list of the votes on the journals of the Senate and the House of Representatives. Members of the Congress, the purpose for which the joint session of the two houses of Congress has been called having been accomplished pursuant to Senate Concurrent Resolution 1, 103rd Congress, the Chair declares the joint session dissolved.
Shortly after this joint meeting of the United States Senate and House of Representatives, we opened up our telephone lines to hear from our viewers. Watching the proceedings on C-SPAN in Little Rock were President-elect Clinton and Vice President-elect Gore. They called into our Washington, D.C. studios. Here now is that conversation.
Joining us on the line now, though, is